Chronicles as well, as we started and talked about last week in the where are we at as far as, I guess, how this story goes? What big event took place last week? Do we remember? What big thing happened? Yes, we went from Elijah being God's prophet and issuing out God's judgment and being God's mouthpiece to the mantle essentially being passed over to Elisha. And at the end of chapter 19, we saw Elisha kill his oxen and sacrifice them and get rid of all of his stuff to essentially kind of turn everything over to the Lord. Turn everything over to God's direction in his life as well. So that's kind of, as far as the light that we've kind of been mentioning and kind of talking about throughout this whole thing, the light kind of now is kind of shining on Elisha, I guess. It's kind of where we're seeing God's plan as we kind of move through this. So as we get into chapter 20 today, we're still going to be talking about Ahab. Ahab's still the king here. He's still in the picture. He's still being pretty wicked. But he's kind of still involved with stuff. There is another king as well that we're going to look at, and that is Ben-Hadad. Okay, and both of these kings, Ben-Hadad and Ahab, are extremely proud and kind of want to posture their strength and kind of thump their chest a little bit here in the first part of verse 20. So we're going to see the first part of this lesson is about how proud these two kings were. And we're going to start a little bit today watching God humble these two kings from their pride and from some of the requests that they had. Now, Ben-Hadad is the king of Syria. Okay, so we can just kind of get that out there. And Ben-Hadad had been working as, we've been seeing Ahab here and Elijah. While that has been going on, Ben-Hadad has been surrounding the country of Samaria. Okay, and what he is thinking is that he's just gradually driving closer and closer and closer to Israel's. Hey. You've completely made me lose track here, Pastor Rob. Driving towards Israel's kingdom, Israel's capital, so that he can kind of take it over. We've got to remember that Syria's army is at this time much superior, right? Much greater. It's larger. Their technology is better. There's more men. They've got more cavalry. They have all those things. It's far superior to the army in Israel at this time. But because of Ahab, okay, and we know how proud Ahab was, and because of his pride, he is going to resist this onslaught, resist this posture of strength from Ben-Hadad for quite some time. Eventually, as we end this next week, we're going to see God kind of stepping in and defeating and humble Ben-Hadad down, and also humbling Ahab and Jezebel as well. So let's start with verse number 1 of chapter 20. And we'll go down and read down through verse, we'll start with verse 6. And we'll kind of see here, Ben-Hadad, this king of Syria, we'll see his first request that's pretty proud. So verse 1, chapter 20. And Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, gathered all his hosts together, and there were 30, and 2 kings with him, and horses and chariots. And he went up and besieged Samaria and warred against it. And he sent messengers to Ahab, king of Israel, and into the city, and said unto him, Thus saith Ben-Hadad, Thy silver and thy gold is mine, thy wives also, and thy children, even the goodliest, are mine. And the king of Israel answered and said, My lord, O king, according to thy saying, I am thine, and all that I have. And the messengers came again and said, Thus speaketh Ben-Hadad, saying, Although I have sent unto thee, saying, Thou shalt deliver me thy silver and thy gold and thy wives and thy children, yet I'm going to send my servants unto thee tomorrow, about this time, and they shall search thine house and the houses of thy servants, and it shall be that whatsoever is pleasant in thine eyes, they shall put it in their hand and take it away. Okay, so we see here Ben-Hadad and this request that he has. Now, lesson picks up here right with God's dealing with Israel in the timeline of events. This is the 3.5-year drought, right, that Elijah predicted. Elijah happened because of that. It is just concluded. Okay, so we're picking right up now, right after this 3.5-year drought. The lack of water obviously has been very detrimental to the nation of Israel. The crops are gone. The grass that the livestock used for grazing is in a very, very vulnerable position. It's pretty much almost completely depleted, leaving Israel as a nation itself kind of open to attack. And open to some problems. In comes Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, again understanding that there's quite a bit of vulnerability in the nation of Israel. He is moving to secure and take over Ahab and the nation that Ahab is in charge of. Now, Ahab before had faced off with Assyria from the northeast. And Ben-Hadad mustered, this huge army, this great forces of the neighborhoods or the neighboring countries around to fight Israel. And what did I do with that? There it is. I've got a map of this. I want to show you, kind of see what's going on. So this is the area, of course, again, that we're talking about. Ben-Hadad requested to rummage through Ahab's palace down in Samaria. Now, there's 32 to 34 little country provinces, areas that Ben-Hadad had kind of taken over and had gathered those forces as well to come in and to attack here Samaria, where Ahab is at. So this is a huge army. Right, a large contingent of men and horses and all the things you would kind of expect from an army during this time. Very, very much larger than anything that Israel has at this time as well. All right. So, but before just kind of coming in and just attacking Israel and taking what he wanted, Ben-Hadad kind of sent the king of Ahab. Or sent King Ahab this message demanding that there was a full surrender of his army, a full surrender of his wealth, a full surrender of his wives and his children, and all of the things. Kind of had to give up all of these things. That's what we see here in verses 2 and 3, again of chapter 20. Right, he sends these messengers into Israel, into the city, and they come to the king Ahab in verse 3, and it says, "Thy silver, thy gold, it's mine. The wives, all the children, even the goodliest of them, all that stuff is mine." Okay, so he has taken siege and told Ahab that he is going to come in and take all of these things. Now, at first, we see in verse 4 that Ahab answers the demands. Right? He says, "And the king of Israel answered and said, My Lord, O king, according to thy saying, I am thine and all that I have." All right, so Ahab gets this, he hears this request or this demand essentially, and he folds very, very quickly. Now, King Ahab here would have known and had a very good understanding of what the history of the nation of Israel had accomplished to this point. And there has been some pretty astute and astounding things that the nation of Israel has been able to kind of just take and they have done. And all of that because, of course, some blessings from God. King Ahab would have known this, should have known this, and should have kind of realized that this old boy from Syria who, had some strength and had quite an army, really had no right to come in here and do what he did to God's chosen people. But Ahab, being kind of as far gone as he could possibly be from the will of God, at first, very quickly, just kind of folds over and accepts the demands that Ben-Hadad had kind of wanted to come in. Then we get to verses 5 and 6, though, and we see, a couple of the other things, I guess, that Ben-Hadad wanted to do as well. Let's look at verse 5. And it says, and the messengers came again. So this is after Ahab has agreed to the first initial terms. The messengers then come back and say this, that speaketh Ben-Hadad, saying, although I have sent unto thee, saying, thou shalt deliver me silver and gold and thy wives and thy children, and you've accepted that, I'm also going to, in verse 6, I'm going to send my servants unto thee tomorrow about this time. And what are they going to do? What are these servants going to do? They're going to just come in and essentially go through everything, right? Going to go through the king's palace, his quarters, all of his servants' quarters as well. They're going to look at everything. And as they're looking at stuff, what are they going to do? Whatever they think was going to tickle the king's fancy, right? They're going to load it up and take it back to the king. And that's what the plan was. So he pushed Ahab to a point. He figured, well, that was pretty easy. I expected a little bit of pushback from Ahab. I got none. Let's see how far we can push the old boy. So he says, we're going to just, after I've done taking those things, I'm going to come in and we're going to just look around. Or there's anything that I think that I might like, I'm going to bring it back to me as well. And then we get to verse number 7. And we see Ahab's response, okay, to this request, this demand from Ben-Hadad. And then the king of Israel's, the king of Israel called on God, right? Is that what it says? No, it does not, right? What did it say? Then the king of Israel did what? Called the elders of the land and said this, Mark, I pray you, and see how this man seeketh a mischief. For he sent unto me for my wives and for my children and my silver and my gold, and I denied him not. And all the elders and all the people said unto him, hearken not unto him, nor consent. And wherefore he said unto the messengers of Ben-Hadad, tell my lord the king all that thou didst send for to thy servants at the first I will do. But this thing I may not do. And the messengers again departed and brought him word again. So what is the response here from Ahab? Talks to the elders first, and then his response back to Ben-Hadad was what? Kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting, right? He says, I'm good with you taking my wives. I'm good with you taking the children, the gold, whatever. The first thing I told you that you could do, right? Again, let's look at verse 9. Wherefore he said unto the messenger, behold, tell my lord, the king, all that thou didst send for thy servants at first, I will do. So you can take the wives, take the gold, take the silver, take the children. I'm okay with that. But when you've mentioned coming in and taking the rest of my stuff that you want, that's where I draw the line. I will not comply with the second request. So the elders told Ahab to reject Ben-Hadad's request, and Ahab sent back word to Ben-Hadad that he was good with the first request, but Ahab returned to whom? To God. We never see him doing that. It's important for us. He never even entertained the idea of asking God how he should respond. But, of course, with Ahab, that's expected, right? We expect him not to do that. If Ahab was counting on anything, he was counting on his false gods to bail him out. It's probably not a good joke, was it? No, but that was stuck back there, didn't it? All right, waiting on his false gods to bail him out. Only a proud king would reject and an offer of safety and peace from a king that could literally come in and crush him at any moment. So Ahab here obviously had some fear, and probably had quite a bit of fear of Ben-Hadad, but he let his own pride and his own, what he thought he was doing right, act up. Look at verse 10. It was proud kings, right? So we're going to see, not any humble responses here. And Ben-Hadad sent unto him and said, the gods do so unto me, and more also, if the dust of Samaria shall suffice for handfuls for all of the people, that follow me. So the reaction here, the response, Ben-Hadad boldly states that Syria is going to show up and completely annihilate Samaria. Going to come in and just completely crush it. And Ben-Hadad said unto him and said, the gods do so unto me, and more also, if the dust of Samaria shall suffice for handfuls for all of the people that follow me. He trusted here, Ben-Hadad was trusting his gods and trusting the fact that his gods would give him complete victory, to the point that he uses the analogy there that only a pinch of dust would be left for each of the followers to carry back to Syria. That's how much he was going to just completely destroy it. So we see again Ben-Hadad's pride, and probably to a certain degree here, just as outsiders kind of looking in on this story, we can understandably get where Ben-Hadad has this confidence and has this pride at. Because he's conquered a lot of stuff. He has this huge army, and Israel's pretty much down to nothing. So we kind of get where he kind of has this confidence in himself and in his armies. He had Samaria at this time surrounded completely by this huge, large, very well equipped, very well rationed army. And as a king or a leader sitting in his life, this battle looked like it would take no time at all. He would lose very few men, and that this would be very, very successful to him. The gods were in his favor. The numbers were in his favor. The resources, everything was in his favor. There's literally nothing here that was against him. So we can see where he kind of had this confidence. Now we get to verse 11. So he sends this back to Ahab. That's fine. You don't want to do that. We're going to come in and there's not even going to be dust left in this place. That's how much we're going to destroy you. And then Ahab responds. And the king of Israel answered and said, tell him, let not him that girdeth on his harness boast himself as he that putteth it off. Let's read that again. Let not him that girdeth on his harness, boast himself of he that putteth it off. How would we put that into our own words? What's the response here from Ahab? How would you guess paraphrase that?
Count your chickens before they hatch.
Exactly. That's actually one of the things I had written down. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. Right? Just because you think you've got this thing. This was a rather witty, confident response from Ahab back to Ben-Hadad. And the wittiness and the confidence in this response, probably it may have stemmed from the fact that he had trusted in Baal so much that he expected Baal to deliver him. It could have been simply that Ahab just got so caught up here in this essentially this contest going back and forth of which one of these guys has the bigger ego, that he got so caught up in it that he didn't even pause to think about what Ben-Hadad could probably really do and how impossible it was going to be for him to defeat the army. But Ahab quickly responded with, don't, just because you think you've got this thing, you don't really know what we're capable of doing over here. So he sends that back to Ben-Hadad. Right, and this is just about as typical as just two people going back and forth, not wanting to back down as you could expect. We get to verse 12 of this, and then when Ben-Hadad here in verse 12 hears this message, then he responds again. And it came to pass when Ben-Hadad heard this, that as he was drinking, he and the kings in the pavilions, that he said unto his servants, set yourselves in array. And they set themselves in array against the city. So, and he heard the response. He calls on his servants to summon the troops for an attack. Go ahead and start for a siege on the city. And to Ben-Hadad's way of thinking now, he was there with his other buddies in the pavilion, and they're drinking and carrying on and having a good time, and he's just doesn't even think that there's no reason at all for him to doubt any type of victory at all. He's not even concerned. He's not even going to go, right? He's going to stay back and continue with what he's doing, his raucous behavior. He's just going to send the army out and say, boys, go ahead and have at it. Go ahead and go take it on, because he's so confident. His confident level was so high that the people who were around him, the coalition of kings or the generals of his armies, took part in the revelry as well. They continued to drink their wine to excess, even before there was one single drop of blood. Now, knowing how this episode ends might cause us, the reader or the person looking at the story, to think that Ahab really wasn't so crazy. But remember that he did not yet know that God was going to step in and fight this fight for him and give him this victory. His pride put him in a terrible place, at a terrible position, but that was all part of God's plan in the humbling of Ben-Hadad, which is what we see starting in verse 13. The Lord humbling here Ben-Hadad. All right, now, God's got his plan in place here to humble it, and he has sent this plan into motion by sending a prophet that is unnamed to King Ahab. Look at verse 13. And behold, there came a prophet unto Ahab, king of Israel. Now, we don't know who this prophet's name is, don't have a name for him. And said, Thus saith the Lord, Hast thou seen all this great multitude? Behold, I will deliver it into thine hands this day, and thou shalt know that I am the Lord. And Ahab said, By whom? And he said, Thus saith the Lord, even by the young men of the princes of the provinces. And he said, Who shall order? And he answered and said, Thou, or you. You're the one ordering the battle. All right, so God's got the plan here in motion. He sends this prophet to Ahab, this unnamed prophet, and he essentially tells Ahab that, as we saw in verse 10, the prophet begins this message here with this rhetorical question that we see in verse 13 again. Have you not seen this host? Right? Hast thou seen all this great multitude? Essentially, the prophet's saying is, Ahab, are you crazy? Have you not seen the people that are out there, this huge army that is essentially now coming for you? How do you think you could possibly be able to defeat them? Prophet then promises Ahab that God is going to give him this impossible victory. All right, and as we saw in verse 14, the prophet is explaining to him what's going on, and Ahab in verse 14, after he hears this, what is his response? He says, and Ahab said what? By whom? Right? How is this going to happen? Right? What is going to take place? How is this going to work in the way that it is? And this Ahab's desperate here, his desperate plea, or desperate for direction, asked the prophet how he could be victorious, and the prophet here explains in verses 14 and down into 15. So we'll start at verse 15. Then he numbered the young men, this is the prophet, the princes and of the provinces, and he tells them that there are 232. And after them all numbered the people, even all the children being 7,000. So the prophet explains to him that 232 men of princes of the provinces is going to lead this small army of 7,000 people into this vast Syrian confederacy that is heading towards, ready to attack Samaria. All right. Now, in the meantime, over in verse 16, all right, so the prophet now has told Ahab this is what's going to happen. God's going to deliver the victory. This is how he is going to deliver it. In the meantime, we get to verse 16. And over in verse 16, it says, And they went out at noon, but Ben-Hadad was drinking himself drunk in the pavilions, he and the kings, and 32 kings that helped him. And the young men of the prince of the provinces went out first, and Ben-Hadad sent out, and they told him, saying, There are men come out of Samaria. Okay, so these young men, the princes of the provinces, came out to the city, and the army which followed them, and they slew every one his man. And the Syrians fled, and Israel pursued them. And Benhadad the king of Syria escaped on a horse with the horsemen. And the king of Israel went out and smote the horses and chariots, and slew the Syrians with a great slaughter. And the prophet came to the king of Israel and said unto him, Go strengthen thyself, and mark, and see what thou doest, for at the return of the year the king of Syria will come up against thee. And the servants of the king of Syria said unto him, Their gods are gods of the hill, therefore they were stronger than we. But let us fight against them in the plain, and surely we will be stronger than they are. So these 232 front line of Israelites, soldiers, went out and they killed their immediate opponent. The very first person that they came into contact with, they killed. As a result of these 232 people, 232 men killing their first opponent, the Syrian army, as we saw, panicked. Okay, and they fled and took off and retreated, and Israel pursued them. Again, Benhadad now sees this, suddenly sobers up, right? We saw that he was drinking until he was drunk. Quickly sobers up, hops back on his horse, and retreats as well all the way back to Damascus. But as he is retreating, the Israelite soldiers, we saw in verses 19, 20, and 21, right? It says in verse 20 especially, and they slew everyone as man. The Syrians fled, and Israel pursued them. And Benhadad escaped on his horse, verse 21. And the Israelites went out and they smote the horses and the chariots and slew the Syrians. And there was this huge, this great slaughter that happened as well as Benhadad is trying to escape. The Israelite soldiers devastated the foot soldiers, devastated the chariots, and devastated all of these things. Now, that's what took place during the battle, exactly as the prophet of God had told Ahab. Now, what would we expect here Ahab to conclude about the Lord based on this victory, this essentially impossible victory that had just happened? What would we expect? What would you expect Ahab here to conclude about God? That it was him that had done it, right? That he is gracious, and that God is gracious, and he's worthy of worship, and he's worthy of undivided devotion, right? In the midst of this terrible circumstances that Ahab had put himself into, God stepped in, and they destroyed, or are beginning to destroy the Syrian army. Okay? We get to verse 22. And again, after the battle is over, this unnamed prophet shows back up, visits Ahab again, and gives him some advice. And the prophet came to the king of Israel and said unto him, Go, strengthen thyself, and mark and see what thou doest, for at the return of the year the king of Syria will come up against thee. So we see him giving him advice, saying that he needed to go and to prepare for another war against the Syrians that's going to happen in the spring. It's going to happen again. But what we don't see is any indication of Ahab humbling himself before God. But we do see him at least being willing to heed the prophet's warning. Okay? And as we get into verse 23, and we'll start that next week, we've seen now God's display of power. I forgot this was up here. That's Benhadad besieging Samaria. And then, of course, Israel pursuing them, the battle that we've just kind of talked about, and pursues them back towards Damascus. And then next week, we're going to start with verse number 23. God's displayed his power, and now he's going to defend his reputation. He has humbled Benhadad, okay, in 7,232 people, essentially. This really small little army has almost obliterated the Syrian army. Now he's going to humble Ahab. We're going to see Ahab's pride, continued pride, even in the midst of the prophet there essentially telling him God's going to do all these things and them happening. And then we're going to see a humbling of Ahab next week as well as we finish up this lesson. Okay, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you again for an opportunity that we have to look at these stories of the Old Testament and their importance, and how, even in the midst of people who should have been completely and entirely dedicated to you because of the blessings that you had given them, even in the midst of the fact that they still rejected giving you any type of praise or glory or thanks at all for the influence that you were having in their lives. In the midst of all that, yet you are still gracious and loving and concerned for the people, your people, your chosen people, and that you stepped in, well, Lord, even realistically, even when you didn't need to, and maybe even shouldn't have. But you had promised, and you stayed true to your promise of making sure that your chosen people, or that the light would be there, and that's that promise that you gave Abraham and Moses many years ago, that you're holding true to then, as we can see in the Old Testament, Lord, is the exact same promise that we, as children of God, can accept and know as well. That when you promise us things, Lord, we know that you're going to come true on it. We know your power is in that promise, and that we can count on it happening, Lord. So when you've given us the promise of making sure that you're caring for our needs, making sure that you are watching and leading and guiding in our lives, Lord, and that your only requirement for us is obedience to your word and obedience to the ordinances that you've given us, Lord. And Lord, it should be pretty clear and pretty concise for us that the God that's promised us these things, Lord, is going to come through, and we should give you our undivided devotion as well. So I pray that's the takeaway from this, as we continue to look at these lessons and kind of see some of this same stuff happening over and over again. How these people who are away from you understand that they can't do it without you, and then turn their lives over you, and how you continue to bless them, Lord. Same thing for us. But instead of us falling back into our old ways, Lord, that you give us the wherewithal, Lord, give us the spiritual intestinal fortitude, Lord, to understand that we, regardless of the circumstances, that we're focusing on following and obeying you. So I pray that's our desire of our hearts here this morning, Lord. That unequivocally, Lord, that we follow you regardless of circumstances or situations, because we know the blessings that will come because of it. So I pray for Pastor Rob as well as he comes in the next hour, that you just use him, Lord, in a mighty way. That you keep us attentive, Lord, listen to the word, not just with our ears, Lord, but with our hearts, so we can take away more lessons and more truths, Lord, and apply them to our lives and be more effective in our service.